Picture waking up with absolutely no idea who you are. No name, no family, no memory of your own face in a mirror. Now picture living an entire second life like that. A new name, a new town, sometimes a new family, while the people who loved you spend decades believing you're dead. That's not the plot of a movie. It's exactly what happened to every single person in this video. The 5 people you're about to meet all lost themselves completely, in 5 completely different ways. One was a wealthy, world-famous doctor who vanished from his own high society life, not once, but twice. One was found lying behind a dumpster with no idea how he got there, or even what his own name was. One wandered an entire country for 2 decades, homeless, without knowing he had a wife and 2 children waiting for him. One lived 30 quiet years, 2 hours from his own mother, with absolutely no idea she was still alive and still looking for him. And one of them, as you're about to find out, might not have lost her memory at all, which raises the far creepier question of why she let everyone she loved believe she was dead for 31 years. Stick around for that last one, because it doesn't end the way you're expecting. Let's get into all 5 of these stories, one at a time, starting with the strangest of them all. Case 1. William D.R. Bates. Just hours before his mysterious disappearance, on the 30th of August 1902, Dr. William Horatio Bates, a wealthy and highly respected ophthalmologist in the heart of New York City, sat down and scribbled out a hurried letter. He entrusted it to his wife Ada, who was away visiting her mother at the time. In the letter, Bates explained that he had been urgently summoned to travel to a distant location alongside a former student of his, referred to only as Ide, to perform a series of surgical procedures. He never said how long he'd be gone. What stood out most was how excited he seemed about the money he expected to make. Strange, considering he was already a man of considerable wealth. After sending that letter, Dr. Bates vanished. No further letters, no return home, nothing. Before this, Bates had been at the absolute peak of his medical career. Educated at Cornell University and the College of Physicians and Surgeons, he'd served as an attending physician at prestigious institutions including the New York Eye Infirmary and Bellevue Hospital, and had spent 5 years teaching ophthalmology at a respected postgraduate medical school. He wasn't just successful, he was renowned, the kind of doctor other doctors sought out for guidance on difficult cases. He had good looks, wealth, prestige, and the kind of reputation most physicians spend a lifetime chasing and never quite catch. None of that made his sudden vanishing act make any sense. Men like William Bates didn't just disappear. They had too much to lose, and far too much to gain by staying exactly where they were. Desperate, Ada spent days reaching out to acquaintances across the United States and Europe, chasing any lead she could find. Because William was a well-known member of the Masonic Society, she also enlisted the help of the local Masonic community, who helped circulate his picture far and wide. Eventually, a letter arrived from Britain describing a man who bore an uncanny resemblance to the missing doctor, now working as a medical assistant at Charing Cross Hospital in London, after originally being admitted there as a patient. According to rumors, when he'd first arrived at the hospital, he was emaciated, hollow-eyed, and nearly starving, which made absolutely no sense to Ada, since she knew her husband had more than enough money stashed away to live comfortably anywhere in the world. Without hesitation, she boarded the next ship to London, picturing a joyful reunion after weeks of agonizing uncertainty. Instead, her heart shattered the moment she stood in front of him. William didn't recognize her at all. "I don't know why you bothered, madam," he reportedly told her. "We are strangers. Imagine crossing an ocean to save your husband, only to be looked at like a total stranger by the same man who once knew every detail of your life together." Still, he reluctantly agreed to accompany her to a hotel so she could help him try to recover his memory. There, small fragments started to surface. He faintly recalled being summoned aboard a ship to perform a dangerous operation on someone suffering from a brain abscess. Ada stayed by his side in London, desperately hoping more of their shared life would come back to him. It didn't. After just 2 short days together, Bates disappeared on her again. This time, she would never see him again. Refusing to give up, Ada spent years searching, combing through Europe and the entire east coast of America, chasing rumor after rumor. Her relentless pursuit tragically ended in 1907 when she passed away still clutching a cherished portrait of the husband she never stopped looking for. 3 years later, in 1910, Dr. J. Kelly, a close friend of Bates from their New York days, happened to be passing through Grand Forks, North Dakota. There, purely by chance, he recognized his long-lost friend, 8 full years after Bates had vanished. By this point, Bates had quietly built himself a modest ophthalmology practice in Grand Forks, with no memory whatsoever of his old life in New York. Kelly convinced him to come back home, and the two doctors eventually set up a joint practice together in the city Bates had once vanished from. He was around 61 years old at this point, and though he was finally back in familiar surroundings, the years he'd lost never returned to him. Reporters who tried to dig into his story only ever managed to piece together fragments, a wandering doctor somewhere in Europe, later finding an odd sort of peace on the open plains of North Dakota. But William Bates's story didn't end quietly. He went on to become an esteemed attending physician at Harlem Hospital and even found love again. From the outside, his life looked completely back to normal, except for one glaring exception. In 1917, Bates published a bizarre new theory on eye care, claiming that eye strain and nervous tension, not the actual shape of the eyeball, were the real causes of poor vision. He argued that through a specific series of eye exercises and mental relaxation, people could reduce or even completely cure their vision problems without glasses. His theory, published in a magazine run by the infamous wellness huckster Bernard McFadden, exploded in popularity almost overnight, and subscriptions to the magazine skyrocketed as word spread. 3 years later, Bates self-published a full book on the method, earning both a devoted following and fierce criticism from the wider medical community, who dismissed his claims as, at best, wildly exaggerated, and at worst, flatly dangerous. Believers were soon staring directly at objects, practicing what Bates called palming, and in some extreme cases, staring directly at the sun, all chasing the promise of throwing away their glasses for good. A surprising number of his followers swore by it, describing vivid, if fleeting moments of clarity, and a select few even claimed to have ditched their glasses entirely. By 1929, the Federal Trade Commission had had enough, formally accusing Bates of peddling fraudulent and deceptive claims to a public desperate enough to believe him. Even that formal rebuke didn't kill his following. People kept flocking to his method for years afterward, drawn in by the tantalizing idea of fixing their eyesight without ever needing a doctor, a lens, or a prescription again. To this day, what actually happened to William Bates during those missing years remains completely unresolved. Some point to a rare condition called alexia, though that mostly affects communication and doesn't quite fit his case. Others lean toward classic amnesia, or an extremely rare condition called dissociative fugue, a disorder affecting a mere fraction of 1% of the population, which causes sudden memory loss and aimless wandering. Interestingly, true amnesia usually leaves a person aware that they even have an identity to recover, just unable to access it, whereas Bates, at least according to the accounts of those who met him, seemed to genuinely believe there was nothing missing at all. And then there's the far less flattering theory that Bates simply grew tired of his life, his marriage, or some hidden debt, and used the amnesia as a convenient excuse to walk away, twice, from a life that had quietly become suffocating. Whatever the real explanation, William Bates took the truth to his grave when he died in 1931, leaving behind a legacy that's still argued about by both eye doctors and true crime fans alike, a full century later. Bates disappeared as a respected doctor with money, status, and a loving wife, and came back with only fragments of memory and a controversial legacy nobody asked for. Our next case starts in the exact opposite place, with a man who had absolutely nothing at all, found unconscious behind a dumpster, with no wallet, no name, and no way for anyone to even begin looking for his family. Case 2. Benjamin Kyle, the Burger King John Doe. On a late summer day in 2004, in the small, quiet town of Richmond Hill, Georgia, a Burger King employee walked out to take out the trash and came across something horrifying, an unconscious man lying on the ground, completely naked, and swarmed by fire ants. He had no wallet, no driver's license, no identification of any kind, as if someone had deliberately left him there to be found, or not found, at all. Paramedics who arrived on scene quickly noticed his injuries were consistent with repeated blunt force trauma to the head. This wasn't a man who had simply collapsed from exhaustion or illness. Someone had hurt him, badly, and then left him for dead behind a fast food restaurant like a piece of forgotten trash. He was rushed to the hospital, and since nobody had any idea who he was, authorities simply began referring to him as the Burger King John Doe. Investigators searched missing persons databases across the country. Nothing matched. No name, no fingerprints on file, no dental records that lined up with anyone reported missing anywhere in America. He remained unconscious for a period of time at Memorial Health University Medical Center before finally waking up in a hazy, disoriented state. The only thing he could recall was a first name, Benjamin. With nothing else to go on, he chose the surname Kyle for himself, and from that point forward became known as Benjamin Kyle. He had no memory of how he ended up behind that dumpster, and doctors suspected the repeated head trauma he'd suffered may have caused serious, possibly permanent brain damage. For the next decade, Kyle's entire existence revolved around chasing fragments of a past he couldn't fully access. He believed, vaguely, that he had once lived in Indianapolis, Indiana, and had attended the University of Colorado. He was fairly certain he had brothers somewhere. One date stuck firmly in his mind, August the 29th, 1948, a date he believed, correctly as it turned out, to be his real birthday. He also had a faint, half-formed memory of passing through Richmond Hill sometime before he was found. Beyond that, nothing. After being released from the medical center, Kyle found refuge at Grace House, a men's shelter, where he eventually met a woman named Catherine Slater. Moved by his story, Catherine dedicated herself to helping him piece his identity back together, scouring missing persons websites and sharing his photo anywhere she could, hoping that somewhere out there, a parent, a sibling, or an old friend would recognize the face in the photo and finally end the mystery. Despite her efforts, nothing ever came of it. Kyle became something of a local curiosity, a real, living human being with an entire life history that simply didn't exist anywhere on paper. In 2007, 3 long years after he was first found, Kyle was formally diagnosed with retrograde amnesia. His DNA was sent off to the FBI, and his fingerprints were run against national criminal databases. Still nothing. Despite national media attention on his case, not a single person ever came forward to claim him. It genuinely looked like his true identity might remain a mystery forever. In 2011, Kyle relocated to Jacksonville, Florida, working as a dishwasher and living in a small shack provided by a kind-hearted benefactor. He'd more or less accepted that this unknown version of himself might simply be who he was now. But behind the scenes, his DNA profile was still quietly being run against genetic databases, again and again, for more than 2 years. Then, in September of 2015, in a genuinely remarkable twist, a genealogical match finally emerged. Benjamin Kyle's real name was revealed to be William Burgess Powell, a 67-year-old man, originally from Indiana, born on the exact date he'd always believed was his birthday, August the 29th, 1948. With his real identity confirmed, Powell was finally able to get an official ID card, something as simple as a driver's license or a social security card. Things most of us take completely for granted, had eluded him for over a decade. His family, it turned out, had reported him missing all the way back in 1976, a full 28 years before he ever turned up behind that Burger King dumpster. Over the years, they had simply given up hope and assumed he was dead. That's part of the reason none of them recognized him when his story hit national news, appearing on television screens and newspaper front pages for years. It genuinely never occurred to them that he could possibly still be alive after so long, so his face just never registered as familiar. Experts believe Powell may have experienced a severe episode of dissociative fugue, a condition that can cause someone to inexplicably abandon their entire life and, over time, lose their memories and identity almost completely. Not everyone is convinced, though. Online skeptics have pointed out that his story is awfully convenient, and some suspect he may have known exactly who he was the whole time, using amnesia as a way to escape whatever life he was running from: old debts, old relationships, or some private shame nobody has ever uncovered. What complicates that theory is the fact that Powell willingly submitted to DNA testing, fingerprinting, and years of public scrutiny, actively participating in the search for his own identity rather than avoiding it. A strange amount of cooperation for someone supposedly trying to disappear on purpose. Whichever version of the story is true, the case remains one of the most widely discussed amnesia cases in modern American history, still studied by investigators and psychologists alike. Benjamin Kyle spent a decade trying to remember who he was, with an entire country watching and waiting for an answer. Our next case is quieter, stranger, and in some ways even sadder. A man who not only forgot his identity, but spent 20 years wandering an entire country without ever realizing he had a wife, 2 children, and a family desperately searching every corner of that same country for him. Case 3. Gabriel Nagy. In 1976, Gabriel Nagy and his wife Pamela arrived in Sydney, Australia, full of hope for the life they were about to build together in a brand new country, thousands of miles from everything and everyone they'd ever known. Their first child, a son named Stefan, was born soon after, and in 1978 they welcomed a daughter, Jennifer. On the surface, everything looked picture perfect for the young family, but for Gabriel, fatherhood and marriage had arrived faster than he was ready for. He'd never experienced real family life growing up, and the sudden weight of providing for a wife and 2 children left him quietly overwhelmed. A struggle he hid so well that Pamela never noticed anything was wrong, chalking up his tiredness to nothing more than a demanding job. Then, on January the 21st, 1987, everything changed. Gabriel called Pamela to say he'd be home in time for lunch. He never showed up. As the hours dragged on and lunch turned cold on the table, it became clear something was seriously wrong. This was completely out of character for a man who always let his family know where he was. Police launched an investigation, and the next morning, Gabriel's family received devastating news. His car had been found burned out on the side of an empty road, charred almost beyond recognition. 2 weeks into the investigation, police uncovered a strange clue. Gabriel had withdrawn cash from a bank in Newcastle, roughly 100 miles from Sydney, and used it to purchase camping gear, a tent, a sleeping bag, and some rope. Investigators theorized he might be out camping somewhere nearby, and launched an extensive search. After weeks of effort, Gabriel was never found, and police eventually announced that without new evidence, the investigation would be discontinued. Devastated but still clinging to hope, the family relocated to the Sunshine Coast to try to rebuild their lives, making sure to leave their new contact details with police in case Gabriel ever turned up. As more than 2 decades passed with no answers, Gabriel's loved ones slowly, painfully accepted that he was probably dead. Just as a coroner was preparing to officially declare him deceased, closing the book on a case that had haunted the family for over 20 years, an extraordinary document surfaced. Medicare records showed that someone under Gabriel's name had undergone eye surgery. A closer look revealed the medical records actually belonged to a man named Ron Sanders, living in Mackay, nearly 8,000 kilometers from where Gabriel had vanished, practically on the opposite side of the entire country. Why would a total stranger be using Gabriel's identity? Was it fraud, identity theft, or something far stranger? Detective Georgia Robinson eventually managed to reach Ron by phone. What he told her was nothing short of astonishing. Ron explained that he had almost no memory of the past 2 decades of his life. He'd spent years wandering from place to place, homeless, with no real sense of who he was, until he eventually found refuge at the River of Life Church in Mackay. To determine whether Ron was truly Gabriel, Georgia met with him in person and began showing him old photographs and letters written by his wife and daughter. Slowly, like water breaking through a dam, memories began flooding back. The very first thing he recalled was buying camping equipment in Newcastle with his credit card. He had absolutely no memory of any car accident, just an unexplainable blank where that memory should have been, along with an overwhelming, inexplicable sense of guilt, which he'd always assumed meant he must have been some kind of criminal on the run. In reality, that guilt most likely came from having unknowingly abandoned his wife and children. Experts believe the same accident that destroyed his car also triggered a rare form of amnesia known as dissociative fugue, wiping out his entire identity as a husband and father in one traumatic instant. After crawling from the wreckage of his car, Gabriel had wandered for 2 straight decades. First to Gladstone, then to Rockhampton, where he took up temporary farm work, and eventually to the coastal town of Cardwell in far north Queensland, drifting from town to town with no fixed destination and no memory of ever having one in the first place. There, he stumbled across a stretch of coastline called Saunders Beach, and something about the name simply felt right to him. A strange, unexplainable pull toward 2 syllables that meant absolutely nothing to him on paper. With no memory of his real identity, he adopted the name Ron Saunders, reasoning that it sounded pretty Australian. Later, he found an old bicycle at a rubbish dump and rode it south for several days, stopping only to eat and sleep, until he finally arrived, utterly exhausted, in the city of Mackay. That's where he crossed paths with the pastor of the River of Life Church, who took one look at his sunken eyes and hollow cheeks, the unmistakable look of a man who had been surviving on scraps and willpower alone, and immediately offered him food and shelter. Grateful, Gabriel spent the next 2 years living and working at the church as its caretaker, quietly rebuilding a version of stability out of a life he couldn't remember losing. Then, one ordinary day, a flood of memories suddenly came rushing back, and Gabriel realized, all at once, that Ron Saunders wasn't a real person at all. His real name was Gabriel Nagy. Later, when he needed eye surgery, he chose to sign the paperwork under his real name, which is precisely how Detective Georgia Robinson was eventually able to track him down. After years of separation, Gabriel's family was overjoyed to be reunited with him. Although he had no immediate plans to leave the life he'd built in Mackay, he stayed in close, constant contact with his family from that day forward. Gabriel wandered across an entire country before his memory returned in one sudden, overwhelming flood. Our next case is quieter but no less remarkable, because it took a full 30 years, and a series of strange, unexplained visions that crept in slowly rather than all at once, before this man even suspected he wasn't who he thought he was. Case 4. Edgar Latulip. In 1986, a man named Edgar Latulip left the Waterloo region of Ontario, Canada, and set out toward the city of St. Catharines on a trip that should have taken no more than a couple of hours by car. Along the way, he made a stop in the Niagara region, and at some point during that stop, he suffered a traumatic head injury that would completely alter the rest of his life. When Edgar regained consciousness, he found himself unable to recall almost anything about his past. With no memory to fall back on, he did the only thing he felt he could do. He built a brand new identity, and quietly started his life over in St. Catharines, with absolutely no idea that his real family, back in Waterloo, was frantically searching for him. For the next 30 years, Edgar kept an extremely low profile. He rarely left home, relied on social services to get by, and avoided social media entirely, the kind of quiet, invisible existence that made him almost impossible to find, even though he was living less than 2 hours away from the family who never stopped looking for him. That all changed in January of 2016, when Edgar began experiencing strange visions, fleeting glimpses of a life he couldn't quite place, faces and places that felt oddly familiar without any context attached to them. Unsettled, he reached out to his social worker in St. Catharines and confided in her about what he was seeing, telling her he suspected he might be suffering from amnesia and that he believed his real name might be Edgar Latulip. Determined to help, his social worker searched the internet for that name and made an astonishing discovery. 30 years earlier, a man by that exact name had indeed gone missing from the Waterloo region. Authorities and police in St. Catharines reached out to Edgar for an interview, and to everyone's amazement, he began recalling small, specific details of his old life, the kind of details only the real Edgar Latulip could possibly know. To remove any remaining doubt, he agreed to submit a DNA sample, which was compared against a sample his mother, Wilson, had already provided to Waterloo Regional Police the previous year. The results came back as a match. Sadly, Edgar's father had already passed away in the year 2000, never learning what had happened to his son, carrying that unanswered question with him to the grave. His mother, however, was still alive and had never given up hope of being reunited with him, even after 3 full decades of silence. After 30 long years apart, mother and son were finally brought back together. She could barely recognize him. The last time she'd seen her son, he'd been an anguished 21-year-old. Now, he stood in front of her as a calm, content 50-year-old man, a completely different person shaped by 3 decades she knew absolutely nothing about. Overwhelmed with remorse, Edgar immediately apologized to his mother for everything she'd been put through, before excitedly telling her about the fulfilling life he'd quietly built for himself in St. Catharines, the friends he'd made, and the sense of belonging he'd finally found, even without ever knowing his own real history. Every year in Canada, tens of thousands of people are reported missing. Most are located within a matter of days, but a small percentage are never seen or heard from again. Edgar's case remains one of the longest-running missing persons investigations the Waterloo Regional Police Service has ever handled, and one of the very few that ended not in tragedy, but in a genuine, decades-late reunion. Edgar's disappearance turned out to be a tragic accident with a genuinely happy ending, decades later than anyone could have hoped for. Our final case tonight is something else entirely, because unlike everyone else on this list, this woman was never actually missing due to amnesia, a head injury, or a wandering mind at all. As far as anyone can tell, she simply let her entire family believe she was murdered, for 31 straight years, without ever offering so much as a hint of why. Case 5. Petra Pasitka. In the mid-1980s, 24-year-old Petra Pasitka was a computer science student living in Braunschweig, Germany, sharing a home with fellow university students, described by everyone who knew her as intelligent, passionate, and relentlessly cheerful. She was close with her family, and everyone was looking forward to celebrating her younger brother's upcoming birthday. On the evening of July the 26th, 1984, Petra headed out for what was described as a routine dentist appointment, planning to meet up with her family shortly afterward. She never arrived. As the hours passed with no word from her, panic set in. Police were called, and Petra was officially reported missing. Investigators traced her last known movements to a lonely bus stop, and from there, the trail went completely cold, as if she'd simply stepped off the edge of the earth. Her family was torn between 2 horrifying possibilities: that she'd been taken against her will, or that something far worse had happened to her. The idea that she might have simply chosen to walk away from her own life never seriously crossed anyone's mind. She was, by every account, a happy, well-adjusted young woman with a bright future and a family who adored her, exactly the kind of person nobody expects to vanish on purpose. 3 years later, in 1987, a chilling confession emerged from a convicted 19-year-old murderer known as Gunter K., who had already been accused of killing a 14-year-old victim near that exact same bus stop. Gunter claimed he had also murdered Petra, disposing of her body in a nearby river, though her remains were never actually recovered. Investigators had no reason to doubt him. He knew the location, he knew the timeline, and he was already a proven, convicted killer operating in that exact area. It was, by every measure available at the time, an open and shut explanation for an otherwise unsolvable case. 2 years after that confession, with no body and no further leads, Petra was formally declared legally dead, and her case was quietly archived. Her devastated family could hardly bear the thought that their kind, vibrant daughter had been the victim of such a senseless act of violence. For 31 agonizing years with no remains ever found, her parents and brother couldn't even give her the proper burial they so desperately wanted to give her, forced instead to grieve someone who, unbeknownst to them, was still very much alive. Then, in September of 2015, everything about the case was turned completely upside down. During a routine investigation into a reported robbery in a German city, police came across a 55-year-old woman with absolutely no official identification to her name. The woman, who initially identified herself as a Mrs. Schneider, had contacted local police hoping to file a complaint after her home was burglarized. When officers asked for identification, she stumbled over her words, unable to produce a single official document. Pressed further, she finally admitted the truth. She was Petra Pasitka, the young German woman everyone believed had been murdered more than 3 decades earlier. Petra confessed that she had orchestrated her own disappearance from the very beginning, carefully planning and quietly saving money for months before she vanished, meaning that on the very same night her family assumed she'd been abducted or murdered, she had, by her own admission, simply chosen never to come home again. Investigators soon discovered that she had spent the past 30 years living like a ghost. No bank account, no official paperwork, paying for absolutely everything in cash, and constantly relocating before eventually settling down in the same city for her final decade off the grid. Remarkably, because there was no concrete evidence of forged documents or any other identifiable crime, authorities ultimately decided not to press any charges against her at all. In the eyes of the law, choosing to disappear, even for 31 years, even while an innocent man's confession sent an entirely wrong story into the record books, apparently isn't a crime in itself. News of her survival spread rapidly, eventually reaching her surviving family members, her mother and brother, since her father had already passed away without ever learning the truth. For 3 decades, they had grieved a murder that never actually happened, built entirely on the confession of a killer who, for reasons nobody has ever explained, falsely claimed responsibility for a woman he apparently never touched. To this day, Petra's exact motive for disappearing remains a complete mystery. She has refused every opportunity to reconnect with her family and has never spoken publicly or to the media about why she did what she did, or why a decades-long false murder confession was allowed to stand completely unquestioned for so long. She still lives quietly in the same German city where she was found, except now, with nothing left to hide, she finally goes by her real name again. 5 completely different kinds of disappearing. A world-famous doctor who came back a stranger to his own wife, twice, and left behind a legacy, still debated a century later. A man found behind a dumpster who spent a decade fighting to remember his own name, only to discover his own family had quietly given up on him decades earlier. A father who wandered an entire country for 20 years without knowing he had a wife and 2 children waiting for him, rebuilding an entire identity out of nothing more than a beach with a nice-sounding name. A son whose 30-year absence finally ended with a mother recognizing him, despite everything time had changed about his face and his life. And a woman who, as far as we can tell, remembered exactly who she was the entire time, and simply chose to let everyone she loved believe she was gone forever, even while an innocent false confession sat on record as the official explanation for her death. That last one is the one that should really stick with you. Amnesia is tragic, but at least it's an explanation. It's something that happens to a person, not something a person chooses. Petra Pozitka's silence isn't an explanation at all. It's a choice she's never once been willing to justify, even after being found, even after 31 years, even after her own family spent 3 decades mourning a version of events that was never actually true. If this one kept you guessing until the very end, make sure you're subscribed, because we've got more mysteries just like these on the way. Let us know in the comments which case you think is the most disturbing. The ones who genuinely lost themselves through no fault of their own, or the one who might never have been lost at all. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Imagine spending 14 years searching for your missing son, only to learn he was alive the entire time, living in the woods, and didn't want to be found. Imagine believing your husband drowned at sea, grieving him, collecting his life insurance, moving on with your life, and then getting a phone call 5 years later telling you he's very much alive and was never on that canoe to begin with. These aren't scenes from a movie. They are real people, real families, and real disappearances that were never what they seemed. Today we're looking at 5 cases of people who vanished, not because something happened to them, but because they made the choice to walk away from their own lives. Stick around, because case number 2 on this list involves one of the most audacious insurance frauds in modern history, and it will make you question how well you really know the people closest to you. Case 1. Carlos de Salazar. Our first case takes us to Bilbao, Spain, and begins with a young man who, by every outward measure, had everything figured out. Carlos Sanchez. Ortiz de Salazar was brilliant. By the age of 26, he was already a licensed physician and a trained psychologist, fluent in multiple languages, and working as a practicing doctor. His colleagues described him as humble, thoughtful, and endlessly patient with his patients. His family adored him. On paper, Carlos was the picture of success. But underneath that success was a young man quietly buckling under pressure. The expectations placed on him by his parents, combined with the demands of his own perfectionism, had been feeding a private battle with depression and anxiety for years. A battle almost no one around him knew was happening. Then, in November of 1996, Carlos simply didn't show up to work. For a man known for his punctuality, this was immediately alarming. His parents rushed to his home and found it empty. They called his friends, his colleagues, anyone who might know where he was. Nobody had seen him. With no other option, they went to the police. A search began almost immediately, but investigators quickly ran into a wall. There was no starting point. No one knew where Carlos had last been, what he had been thinking, or where he might have gone. Weeks turned into months, and months turned into years. Despite the combined efforts of police, volunteers, and an entire community, not a single trace of Carlos turned up. His parents refused to accept that their son was simply gone. For 14 years, they kept searching. They hired private investigators. They ran media campaigns, hoping someone, somewhere, had seen him. And for 14 years, they got nothing back. Eventually, in 2010, the Spanish government made it official. Carlos de Salazar was declared legally dead. That should have been the end of the story. It wasn't. 5 years later, on the other side of the Mediterranean, in the Maremma region of Tuscany, Italy, an area known among locals for its wild mushrooms, two hikers set out with barely any food, planning to forage for their meals along the way. When the mushroom hunting didn't pan out, they pushed deeper into the forest, hoping to find something, anything, to eat. That's when they noticed it. Scattered trash, empty cans, discarded bottles, a trail of waste that looked distinctly man-made, deep in a forest where there was no reason for anyone to be living. Curiosity got the better of them, and they followed the trail, straight to a hidden camp, tucked beneath the trees, complete with a makeshift tent and tin cans collecting rainwater. The camp looked abandoned. They assumed they'd found an empty resting spot for the night. They were wrong. A man emerged from the camp. His beard stretched nearly a foot long. His face was gaunt, weathered, and streaked with dirt. Panic took over, and the hikers ran. They found a forest ranger nearby and told him what they'd seen. Intrigued, the ranger agreed to investigate, and the hikers reluctantly led him back through the dense wilderness to the same campsite. This time, the confrontation was more direct. Cornered, the mysterious man had no choice but to reveal who he was. His name, he said, was Dr. Carlos de Salazar. This camp, he claimed, had been his home since 1997, a year after he vanished from Spain. The ranger, understandably skeptical, asked for proof. Carlos reached into his coat and produced an old, expired passport. It matched. The hikers and the ranger were stunned. How does a person survive alone in the wild for what could be nearly 2 decades without anyone ever finding him? One of the hikers had the presence of mind to snap a photo of that passport before the group went their separate ways. When they returned to civilization, they contacted the Spanish consulate and the local police, and word eventually reached Carlos's parents. After 14 years of searching and 5 more years of believing their son was dead, they were told he might be alive. They dropped everything and flew to Italy. Working with Italian officers and guided by the same hikers who had stumbled onto the camp, they made their way back into the forest, to the exact spot where Carlos had just been seen days earlier. He was gone. It was clear he'd left in a hurry. Some of his belongings were still there. The former doctor, once celebrated for his intellect and composure, had been living in what could only be described as squalor, trash, tattered clothing, and cans scattered everywhere. It was almost impossible to reconcile this scene with the man his family remembered. His parents pleaded with Italian authorities to launch a full-scale search of the forest. But officially, there wasn't much authorities could do. Carlos wasn't a missing person in the legal sense anymore. The evidence strongly suggested he had chosen this life. He'd chosen to disappear, and by extension, he'd chosen not to be found. The police declined to commit further resources. Refusing to give up, the Salazar family combed the forest themselves for days. The terrain was harsh, the weather uncooperative, and eventually, with work obligations calling him home, Carlos's father had to return to Spain, but not before promising to come back and keep looking. Carlos's parents have returned to Italy multiple times since then. To this day, they have found no further trace of him. Whether Carlos still lives somewhere in those same woods or has moved on entirely remains a mystery that may never be solved. What we do know is this: a man who once healed others, who mastered languages and excelled in every measurable way, ultimately chose a life of total isolation over everything he once had. And somewhere out there, he may still be living exactly the way he wants to, completely alone and completely off the grid. Carlos walked away from success. Our next case involves a man who walked away from failure and turned his own disappearance into one of the most elaborate frauds Britain has ever seen. Case 2. John Darwin, the Canoe Man. John Darwin was born in 1950 in Hartlepool, a busy port town in County Durham, England. By the time he was 23, he'd married a woman named Anne Stevenson. He spent the next 18 years working as a teacher, before later transitioning into a job as a prison officer. From the outside, his life looked stable, respectable, even a little unremarkable. But John had one obsession that never let go of him: money. Not just having enough of it, having a lot of it. Friends and family recalled that even at his own mother's funeral, wealth was one of the main things on his mind. He tried his hand at property, buying up cheap houses around Durham, hoping to rent them out. That didn't pan out. He moved on to the stock market, going so far as to install 17 separate phone lines in his house just so he could trade during his free time. That didn't work out either. At one point, seemingly to project an image of success he didn't actually have, he bought an expensive Range Rover, even as his finances were quietly collapsing underneath him. By 2001, the debt collectors were calling. John was too proud to file for bankruptcy and too stubborn to accept failure, so he came up with a plan instead, a plan that would define the next several years of his life. He decided to fake his own death and collect the life insurance. On the 21st of March, 2002, John told his wife he was heading out for a canoe ride. He never came home. When he didn't return, Anne raised the alarm, and police and Coast Guard teams launched a large-scale search. The next morning, his paddle was found floating in the water. 6 weeks later, his damaged canoe turned up near a secluded spot known as the Blue Lagoon. John himself was never found. After 6 agonizing months, Anne made a heartbreaking public statement. She simply wanted to bury her husband's body so she could begin to move on. The following spring, an inquest formally declared John Darwin dead, ruling that the sea had claimed his life. With a death certificate in hand, Anne collected close to £250,000, $137,000 from an insurance payout, plus his prison service pension, a separate life insurance policy, and his teacher's pension on top of that. Here's the twist. John was alive the entire time, and Anne knew it. For years, John lived a double life just steps from his own front door. He moved into a cramped, single-room flat directly next to the home he supposedly no longer lived in. During the day, he'd hide out there. At night, he'd sneak into his own house through a hidden doorway behind a wardrobe, a passage he later poured concrete over just to stop it from creaking. Not even his own children knew their father was alive. Only Anne. As the years went on, John grew bolder. He started walking around outside in broad daylight, using a woolly hat and an exaggerated limp as a disguise, pretending to be recovering from an injury in case a neighbor got too curious. When family members came to visit, he'd slip into a wig and glasses and pass himself off as Tom the Handyman. At one point, a former colleague from the prison spotted him in public. When police followed up, John managed to talk his way out of it, convincing them the sighting was just a case of mistaken identity. A cousin who happened to look like him. Eventually, John got bold enough to build an entirely new legal identity. He searched local cemeteries for the grave of a child born around the same time he was, and used that child's birth certificate to apply for a brand new passport under a different name. With this new identity in hand, he flew to the United States in 2004, where, through an online role-playing game, of all things, he made contact with a woman named Kelly Steele, a mother of 3 from Kansas. John convinced Kelly to put up £25,000 of his own money to help purchase a ranch. spinning a story about having made a fortune in the stock market and about always wanting to live out a cowboy fantasy. But not long after arriving in the U.S., his tone shifted. He began aggressively demanding his money back, sending Kelly threatening emails that left her genuinely afraid for her safety. Undeterred, John moved on to his next scheme, this time in Panama, where he started a company, bought a Toyota Land Cruiser, invested in property, and eventually sank another 200,000 pounds into a stretch of land near the Panama Canal, with plans to develop it into a tourist resort. But the walls were closing in. Police had already received tips suggesting John might still be alive. And when Panama tightened its visa regulations in 2006, John realized his fake identity wouldn't survive the added scrutiny. So, he devised one final plan, arguably his boldest. He decided to walk back into his old life and blame it all on amnesia. On the evening of December 1st, 2007, a 57-year-old John Darwin strolled into a London police station and made a stunning announcement. "I think I am a missing person." He could recall his name, his date of birth, and other basic details with no trouble at all, but claimed he had absolutely no memory of the past 5.5 years. Anne, seemingly overjoyed, spoke to the media about her husband's miraculous survival, but the story didn't hold up for long. A photograph had already surfaced online, taken during his time in Panama, showing John and Anne together, house hunting, very much alive and very much a couple. Combined with a string of sightings from people who recognized him over the years, police were able to build a case that completely dismantled his amnesia story. In 2008, after admitting to 8 separate counts of deception, John Darwin was convicted and sentenced to 6 years and 3 months in prison. Anne was convicted separately for fraud and money laundering and received a sentence of 6.5 years. What started as a desperate escape from debt ended in a scheme so elaborate and so exposed that it became one of the most talked about disappearance frauds in British history. John Darwin disappeared to build a fortune. Our next case is about a mother who disappeared to escape everything else, and what her family discovered. When she finally came home was almost harder to process than her absence. Case 3. Brenda Heist. Brenda Heist looked by all appearances like an ordinary mother of 2, living in Pennsylvania with her husband Lee. On the morning of February 8, 2002, she said goodbye to her 12-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter, dropped them off at school just like any other day. It would be the last time they'd see her for over a decade. When the kids came home that afternoon, the house was silent, no mother waiting with a smile. Dinner wasn't started, laundry sat unfinished. There was no sign of a struggle, nothing overtly alarming, just an unsettling emptiness. Sensing something was seriously wrong, the children called their father, who immediately contacted the police. 4 days later, Brenda's car turned up abandoned in a parking lot near a bus station in a neighboring county. There was no ransom note, no communication, nothing. Brenda herself was nowhere to be found. Given that Brenda and Lee were in the middle of a difficult divorce and custody battle at the time, investigators understandably looked hard at Lee as a suspect. He submitted to a polygraph test, and with no evidence tying him to her disappearance, he was cleared. Police eventually formed a dedicated cold case task force, but as the years dragged on, Brenda's trail went completely cold. Lee's life, meanwhile, fell apart under the weight of suspicion and financial hardship. He lost his job. He lost his home. Even his own children faced social fallout, with other parents refusing to let their kids associate with a man still quietly regarded by some as a possible suspect in his missing wife's disappearance. In 2011, 9 years after Brenda vanished, Lee had her declared legally dead and collected close to $100,000 in life insurance. Then, in April of 2013, everything changed. A detective called the family, and Lee braced himself for the news he'd been dreading for over a decade, that Brenda's remains had finally been found. Instead, he heard something no one expected. Brenda was alive. A 54-year-old woman had walked into the Monroe County Sheriff's Office the day before and voluntarily turned herself in, saying she was a missing person who was simply tired of life on the run and wanted to go home. After confirming her identity, Brenda finally told her story. According to Brenda, her marriage had been falling apart, and in a moment of desperation, she'd applied for housing assistance to try to secure her own place. When that application was denied, she found herself sitting alone in a park, overwhelmed and in tears, unsure how she was ever going to manage raising her children on her own. That's when, she claims, 2 men and a woman approached her. After hearing her story, they invited her to hitchhike with them down to Florida. In a moment she would spend the next decade regretting, Brenda said yes. She parked her car near the bus station and simply walked away from her life. For the first several years, she lived in a trailer home with an unnamed man, picking up odd jobs, cleaning houses, babysitting, to get by. At one point, she stole a driver's license from one of her cleaning clients and used it to build a new identity. She also picked up charges for drug possession and various traffic violations along the way, all under her fake name, which is part of why investigators never connected the dots back to her. While Brenda was rebuilding a secret life under a stolen name, her son and daughter were left in total limbo with no idea whether their mother was alive or dead. Eventually, her relationship with the man she was living with fell apart, and Brenda found herself homeless, sleeping in tents, sheltering under bridges, scavenging restaurant waste, and panhandling just to survive. At one point during this period, a woman named Sandra Forrester came forward to say she had unknowingly employed Brenda as a housekeeper back in 2010, under yet another fake name. Brenda had told Forrester she was a childless widow whose husband had worked for a hotel chain and had passed away. A story built entirely out of fiction. She eventually moved in with Forrester as a live-in housekeeper for nearly a year, using her free time to browse the internet and even use online dating sites, all while living an entirely fabricated identity mere hours from the family she'd left behind. When Brenda finally turned herself in, she was described as overwhelmed with shame, tearful, and remorseful. But coming home didn't mean healing old wounds. Her ex-husband said the children wanted nothing to do with her. Her daughter, Morgan, then 20 years old, was blunt about it publicly, saying she didn't believe her mother deserved to see her, and in a since-deleted post expressed hope that her mother would face serious consequences for what she'd put the family through. Brenda ultimately received a 1-year jail sentence, not for her disappearance itself, but for a probation violation tied to her earlier use of a stolen driver's license. After her release in November of 2014, she moved to Texas to live with her own mother, reportedly with plans to pursue mental health treatment before attempting any kind of reconciliation with the children she left behind. Whether that reconciliation ever fully happened is something Brenda has largely kept private, leaving her family and the public with more questions than answers about what really drove a mother to walk away from everything for over a decade. Brenda's disappearance was driven by desperation. Our next case is something else entirely. A man who didn't just disappear once, but rebuilt an entire second life under a stranger's name, right up until fate caught up with him in the most unlikely way. Case 4. Richard Hoagland. Richard Hoagland was a middle-aged family man from Indiana. His first marriage ended in a difficult divorce, but he didn't let that stop him from trying again. In 1982, he remarried a woman named Linda Iser, and the two seemed genuinely happy together. They had 2 sons, Douglas and Matthew, and by all appearances built a loving, stable home. Richard was known as energetic, funny, and easy to be around. Life, for a while, looked good. Then came February 10th, 1993. Richard called Linda to say he wasn't feeling well and needed to go to the hospital, promising he'd be home later that evening. It was the last time she ever heard his voice. The next morning, Linda called the hospital to check on him, only to be told there was no record of any patient by his name. Panic set in. She searched everywhere, their home, his workplace, with no luck, and eventually turned to the police for help. A search effort was launched, pulling in friends, family, and the wider community. But it turned up nothing. Eventually, police found Richard's vehicle neatly parked at the local airport, seemingly abandoned on purpose. Given how his first marriage had ended, some assumed there might be trouble at home, but by all accounts his relationship with Linda looked solid on the surface. Months later, something strange happened. Richard's 2 sons each received a birthday card in the mail, each containing a crisp $50 bill and a note signed simply, "Dad." One read something to the effect of, Maybe someday we'll see each other again, but I bet I won't even recognize you. It's been so long. Mind your mother." The cards raised more questions than they answered. Some speculated a well-meaning relative had sent them to offer the family some comfort. Investigators, on the other hand, grew suspicious of Linda herself, wondering if she'd had something to do with Richard's disappearance and staged the cards as a cover. Others floated theories involving drugs. Linda was brought in for questioning, but with nothing solid to tie her to his disappearance, she was cleared. A decade passed with no new leads, and Richard Hoagland was declared legally dead by the state of Indiana. With their primary provider gone, the family fell into serious financial hardship. Their eldest son, Douglas, turned to drugs to cope and eventually ended up in prison on possession charges, serving an 8-year sentence. Linda, now grieving both a husband and, in effect, a son, sank into a deep depression. But for the sake of her boys, she pushed through it, eventually remarrying and trying to rebuild a stable life. Then, in the summer of 2016, 23 years after Richard vanished, a phone call from the Pasco County Sheriff's Department in Florida shattered the peace Linda had worked so hard to rebuild. Richard Hoagland, her husband, presumed dead for over 2 decades, was sitting in police custody. When Linda finally saw him in person, now 63 years old, the first thing she wanted to know was simple. Where had he been all this time? The answer, it turned out, was almost mundane compared to the mystery surrounding it. Back in 1993, the couple had been drowning in financial pressure, and Richard simply couldn't handle it. So he ran. He eventually settled in Florida, entered into a third marriage with a woman named Mary, and even had another child, all while his first family back in Indiana believed he was dead. So, how did he stay hidden for 23 years? After fleeing Indiana, Richard rented an apartment in Florida where he came across the death certificate of a man named Terry Szymanski, who had died in a boating accident back in 1991. Richard tracked down Terry's birth certificate through public records and used it to obtain a driver's license under Terry's name. From there, he built an entire second life, a mortgage, a home, a marriage, all under a dead man's identity. But secrets like that rarely stay buried forever. Terry Szymanski's real family eventually began researching their ancestry online and were shocked to discover that their long-deceased relative had apparently remarried years after his death. It took another 3 years for police to formally investigate, but once they did, the truth unraveled quickly. Richard, still insisting his name was Terry Szymanski, folded almost immediately once confronted with the real Terry's death certificate. He was arrested and confessed. His third wife, Mary, was blindsided by the revelation, later telling authorities that Richard had always been evasive about his past and his family, brushing off her questions whenever she asked. Meanwhile, back home, his son Douglas, still in prison at the time, wrote an emotional letter to the court describing how his father's selfish choices had directly shaped the destructive path his own life had taken. His other son, Matthew, took a more sympathetic view, though he acknowledged nothing could fully excuse what his father had done. At his sentencing, Richard reportedly showed up in worn-out sneakers, ragged pants, and a threadbare polo shirt. An appearance many believed was a deliberate performance meant to make him look destitute. The likely motive was simple. He knew Linda intended to pursue him for over 20 years of unpaid child support and wanted to appear as though he had nothing left to give. Richard ultimately pleaded guilty to identity theft and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. A month after his release, he had an awkward, largely silent reunion with the family he had abandoned decades earlier before being sent back to Indiana. By that point, he was completely broke, meaning he was legally unable to pay the restitution Linda had won in court, despite a judge ruling in her favor for close to $1.86 million in back-owed support. In the end, Richard Hoagland got exactly what he seemingly wanted all along, to walk away from his obligations, even after being caught. Richard built a new identity to escape his old life. Our final case tonight is stranger still, because to this day, not even the man at the center of it can fully explain what happened to him. Case 5, Stephen Kubacki. In February of 1978, 23-year-old Stephen Kubacki was an undergraduate at Hope College, a small Christian college along the shores of Lake Michigan. Looking for a bit of solo adventure, Stephen decided to go on a cross-country skiing trip by himself, planning to be gone for no more than a day or two. He never came back. The day after he set out, snowmobilers near Saugatuck spotted his skis and backpack abandoned on the ground and alerted authorities. When investigators examined the belongings, they confirmed they were Stephen's, and a search and rescue operation was launched immediately. Searchers found a trail of footprints in the snow that ran roughly 200 yards toward the edge of the lake, and then simply stopped. Based on the evidence, investigators concluded the most likely explanation was tragic, that Stephen had fallen through the ice and drowned. The area itself has a reputation, stretching from Manitowoc, Wisconsin, to Ludington, Michigan, and down to Benton Harbor, where Stephen vanished. This stretch of water has earned the nickname the Lake Michigan Triangle, after decades of unexplained disappearances, ghost ship sightings, and strange weather patterns. As far back as 1891, a 7-man crew aboard a schooner, called the Thomas Hume, set sail across the lake and was never seen again. Their ship never recovered. For 14.5 months, Stephen Kubaki's family and the wider community believed he was another casualty of these same mysterious waters. Then, on May 5th, 1979, Stephen rang the doorbell at his father's house. He appeared disoriented, almost as if he'd just woken up from an extremely long sleep, and seemed genuinely stunned to learn that more than a year had passed. What memories he did have were strange and fragmented. He recalled waking up in a meadow roughly 40 miles from his father's home, and about 700 miles from Lake Michigan, where he'd disappeared. He was dressed in unfamiliar clothing, carrying a backpack that wasn't his, filled with maps he didn't recognize. He had no memory of anything that had happened in between. One particularly strange detail stood out. He was wearing a t-shirt from a marathon race held in Wisconsin, and later told reporters, "I feel like I've done a lot of running." His very last clear memory before the gap was standing on the snow-covered shores of Lake Michigan. To this day, what actually happened to Stephen Kubacki during those 14 months has never been explained. Some believe he may have experienced a form of dissociative fugue, essentially wandering the country in a prolonged blackout state, with no memory of doing so. Others point to the eerie reputation of the Lake Michigan Triangle, and, as with any story this strange, there are those who floated far wilder theories, including alien abduction. When reporters pressed him for answers, Stephen maintained that he simply didn't remember much of anything from that time, and he was adamant that he had no underlying mental health issues driving the disappearance. In a later interview, he offered his own best guess, that whatever caused the blackouts was likely triggered by fatigue or prolonged exposure to the elements. He mentioned he'd see a doctor for a general checkup, but firmly refused any kind of psychiatric evaluation, insisting his life had been going fine. Good grades, a job lined up after graduation, no problems with relationships, nothing that would explain wanting to vanish. Today, Stephen Kubacki is alive and living in the Pacific Northwest, where, in a twist very few could have predicted, he now works as a psychologist, helping other people make sense of their own minds, even though the mystery of his own missing year remains completely unsolved. 5 very different people, 5 very different reasons for disappearing. A doctor who walked into the woods and never walked back out. A husband who faked his own death for money and nearly got away with it. A mother who left everything behind and lived under a stolen name for over a decade. A man who built an entire second life on top of a dead stranger's identity. And a college student who vanished for over a year with no memory of where he'd been or why. What connects all of them isn't just the disappearance, it's what happens after. The families left behind, waiting for years without answers. The lives quietly rebuilt in the shadows. And the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the person everyone is desperately searching for doesn't want to be found at all. If this video kept you hooked, make sure to subscribe, because we've got more cases just like these coming your way. Real disappearances, real families, and real answers that are often stranger than fiction. Let us know in the comments which of these 5 stories shook you the most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. What if you found out at 16 years old that the woman you called mom wasn't your mother at all? What if the man who raised you, who taught you to ride a bike and helped with your homework, had actually taken you from your real family when you were only 5 and told you a lie you believed for over a decade? These aren't hypothetical questions. They're the real lives of the 5 people you're about to meet. Children who were taken, hidden, and raised under identities that weren't their own, and who only found the truth by accident, by chance, or by pure stubborn refusal to stop asking questions. Every one of these cases starts the same way. A family shattered in an instant, with no note, no explanation, and no way of knowing whether the missing person was ever coming back. But it's what happens next that makes these stories so hard to look away from. Some of these children were raised with love by people who had no right to raise them. Some built entire new lives under names that weren't theirs, only to have those names catch up with them decades later. One of these cases became a national headline that split public opinion right down the middle, with millions of strangers arguing online about who the real victim actually was. Another ends with a family finally getting their answer, a full 44 years too late to do anything about it. Let's get into all 5 of these cases, one at a time, starting with the one that almost single-handedly broke the internet. Story 1, Julian Hernandez. Julian Hernandez was, by every measure, a model teenager, a senior in high school, an excellent student, involved in a long list of extracurricular activities, with his sights set firmly on college. He had the kind of transcript parents dream of: straight A's, strong test scores, a resume of clubs and volunteer work built over years of consistent effort. Life was going exactly according to plan until he sat down to fill out his college applications. One by one, his applications came back denied. Not because of his grades or his test scores, but because of something far stranger: a discrepancy between his name and his social security number. Confused and increasingly anxious, Julian brought the problem to his school guidance counselor, hoping they could help him track down the source of the error and get his paperwork sorted out before deadlines passed. What they uncovered instead would unravel everything Julian thought he knew about his own life. Digging into the records, they discovered that a boy matching Julian's identity had been reported missing 15 years earlier. Julian had spent his entire life completely unaware that he was, technically, a missing person, living under an identity that had been carefully constructed to erase his real past. Shaken and desperate for answers, Julian confronted the one person who might actually know the truth: his father, Bobby Hernandez. Bobby tried to dodge the questions at first, stumbling over his words, clearly hoping to avoid the conversation altogether. But eventually, cornered by his son's persistence, he admitted it. Everything Julian had been told about his life, his name, his history, even the story of what happened to his mother, had been a lie. Overwhelmed and unsure what to do next, Julian did something that would end up putting his story in front of millions of strangers. He posted the entire situation on Reddit, laying out what he'd just learned and asking for legal advice. In his post, he explained that his father had changed both of their names and social security numbers, essentially erasing their old identities to stay hidden from the law. He talked about how his entire sense of self had just been rebuilt from the ground up in the span of a single conversation. He even recalled a strange memory from childhood, his father once asking him, seemingly out of nowhere, whether he would still love him if he found out something terrible that he'd done. So, why exactly would a father kidnap his own son? The story traced back to 2002, when Bobby and Julian's mother were in the middle of a bitter custody battle, the kind of drawn-out legal fight that leaves both parents feeling like they've lost something, no matter which way the ruling goes. The court ultimately sided with Julian's mother, awarding her full custody of 5-year-old Julian. Sometime after that ruling, Bobby asked his ex-wife if he could babysit Julian after kindergarten one day. She agreed. When she came home that evening, both Julian and Bobby were gone. All she found was a note, left behind by Bobby, explaining that he intended to take Julian away for good. Bobby fled with Julian all the way to Cleveland, Ohio, where he built an entirely new life with a girlfriend and her children, blending into a household that, from the outside, looked completely normal. New name, new school records, new social security number. Every detail meticulously rebuilt so nobody would ever ask questions. For 13 years, Julian grew up believing this fabricated version of his life was simply the truth. Whenever he asked about his mother, his father told him she was gone forever. a devastating lie that shaped how Julian understood his own family for over a decade. He grew up thinking he was unwanted by half of his own bloodline, when in reality, his mother had spent every single one of those 13 years desperately searching for him. When Julian's Reddit post went viral, it triggered a fierce debate online, one that honestly still hasn't settled. A huge portion of the reaction focused surprisingly not on Bobby, but on Julian's mother. Some commenters described her as naive, even careless, for having agreed to let Bobby babysit their son unsupervised in the first place. That framing set off its own smaller firestorm, with just as many people pushing back hard, arguing it was deeply unfair to call a mother gullible for trusting her own child's father with an afternoon of babysitting. Nobody, they argued, agrees to hand over their 5-year-old expecting it to be the last time they'll see them for 13 years. That single detail of the story, who deserves the blame when trust is the thing that gets exploited, is arguably what made this case spread as far as it did. Separately, plenty of others sympathized to some degree with Bobby himself, pointing out that he had clearly worked hard to give his son a stable, loving home despite the deception, holding down a job, building a family, raising a straight-A student. Others pushed back hard on that framing too, arguing that people should remember there are always two sides to a story, and that a man capable of kidnapping his own child and lying to him for 13 years was unlikely to be the St. Julian believed him to be. It's a debate that, to this day, still divides people whenever this case comes up. Is it possible to separate a genuinely loving upbringing from the fact that it was built entirely on a crime? Eventually, Julian's school counselor alerted the police, and word reached his biological mother that her son may have finally been found. She'd been through false leads before, so she braced herself for disappointment. But this time, it was real. When investigators confirmed it truly was Julian, she was overwhelmed with relief after 15 years of uncertainty. Bobby Hernandez was arrested in November of 2015. His trial drew significant media attention, in large part because of how unusual the circumstances were. The victim was now an adult, had suffered no physical abuse under his father's care, and stood firmly by his father's side throughout the proceedings, publicly asking the jury to show him leniency. Prosecutors were left in the strange position of building a case around a kidnapping the alleged victim didn't want prosecuted, while still needing to prove, for the sake of the law and for Julian's mother, that what Bobby did constituted a serious crime, regardless of how the relationship had turned out. Despite Julian's pleas, the jury found Bobby guilty of abduction, custodial interference, and forgery of documents. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. As for Julian's mother, she had never given up hope, even after 15 years of dead ends and heartbreak. That unwavering faith was finally rewarded. Over the holidays, following the discovery, mother and son were reunited for the first time in over a decade, sharing an emotional, tearful reunion that neither of them had ever stopped hoping for. Julian's case forces you to ask an uncomfortable question about where love ends and crime begins, and whether a childhood built on a lie can still be called a good childhood. Our next case takes that same question and turns it into one of the most talked about kidnapping cases in American history, because this time, the child, it wasn't just hidden. She was raised for 18 years without ever knowing her name wasn't really her own. Story 2. Camilla Mobley. On the 10th of July, 1998, a 16-year-old girl named Shannara Mobley gave birth to a healthy baby girl in a Jacksonville, Florida hospital. She named her daughter Camilla. Despite her young age and difficult circumstances, Shannara saw her daughter's birth as a turning point, a reason to finally get her life on track. Not long after the birth, a woman dressed in medical scrubs walked into Shannara's hospital room, introducing herself as a nurse. She wasn't. Behind the friendly introduction was a woman in a deep personal crisis, trapped in an abusive relationship, stripped of custody of her own children, and still reeling both physically and emotionally from a recent miscarriage. Overwhelmed with grief and postpartum depression, she had driven to the hospital that day, stood outside the nursery staring at the newborns, and then walked directly into Shannara's room. For hours, this woman stayed by Shannara's side, offering comfort and support, all under the false identity of a hospital nurse. Eventually, she told Shannara it was time to take the baby to check her temperature. Instead, she placed baby Camilla into a leather bag, walked calmly out of the hospital, and disappeared. Shannara was left frantic, desperately calling out for her missing daughter. Within hours, the case exploded into a full-scale investigation. Hospital security footage was pulled, staff were questioned, and police worked with Shannara and other witnesses to build a composite sketch of the mystery woman who had posed as a nurse. The story made national news almost immediately. A newborn, stolen in broad daylight from inside a hospital, by someone calm and confident enough to walk straight out the front door with her. Tips poured in from around the country, and for a while, hope stayed high that Camilla would be found within days. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into years. The composite sketch never led anywhere solid, and as the case aged, it slowly slipped from the headlines into the much colder category of an unsolved abduction. Camilla's abduction became a mystery with no leads, no suspects, and no answers for 18 years. Following a lawsuit against the hospital for its negligence in allowing someone to simply walk in and take a newborn, Shannara was eventually awarded $1.5 million in a settlement. But no amount of money could tell her what had actually happened to her daughter, or whether she was even still alive. Every birthday, every missed milestone, became its own quiet reminder that somewhere out there, a stranger might be raising her little girl as their own. The woman responsible for the kidnapping was named Gloria Williams. In the years that followed, Gloria managed to leave her abusive relationship, regain custody of her own children, remarry, and raise Camilla as her own, under a brand new name, Alexis Manigault. Growing up in South Carolina, Alexis had what looked like a genuinely happy childhood. She had friends, she had siblings, she went to school, she had a normal life in every visible way. But at 16, she stumbled onto something that didn't add up. She had no social security number, which meant she couldn't get a driver's license or apply for jobs like everyone else her age. Something clearly wasn't right, and Alexis eventually confronted the woman she'd always believed was her mother. Gloria admitted the truth. She had stolen Alexis away as a newborn. Even after hearing this, and even when Gloria offered to turn herself in, Alexis refused. Whatever the truth of her origins, she wasn't ready to lose the only mother she had ever known. Imagine being 16 and having to make that decision in the span of a single conversation, knowing that the woman who raised you, who you love unconditionally, built your entire existence on a crime committed against a stranger you've never met. Alexis chose loyalty to the only life she'd ever known, and for another year, she carried that secret entirely on her own. The case finally broke open in January of 2017, when the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children received 2 anonymous tips pointing investigators toward Walterboro, South Carolina. One tip came from a friend Alexis had confided in. The other came from someone who'd overheard Alexis talking about Gloria not actually being her biological mother. When police confronted Gloria and requested a DNA test, the results confirmed it beyond any doubt. Alexis Manigault was Camilla Mobley, the baby who had vanished from a Florida hospital 18 years earlier. The news detonated across national media within hours. This wasn't just a missing persons case closing after nearly 2 decades. It was one of the longest unsolved infant abductions in American history finally being solved. And it reignited a debate that had simmered in true crime circles for years about how a stolen child could grow into an adult who genuinely loved her abductor. Reporters camped outside the family's homes on both sides. Talk shows debated the ethics of the case for weeks. And at the center of all of it was a young woman who suddenly had 2 full names, 2 mothers, and 2 completely different versions of the first 18 years of her life to reconcile. When Shannara received the news, she was overwhelmed with joy. Even though she had gone on to have other children in the years since, her firstborn had never left her thoughts. But the reunion wasn't the simple, joyful moment she had spent nearly 2 decades imagining. For Camilla, who had spent her entire conscious life as Alexis, Gloria Williams was, in every meaningful sense, her real mother. In February of 2018, Gloria pleaded guilty to kidnapping and interfering with custody. During her trial, Shannara testified about the overwhelming grief she carried after her newborn was taken from her. Grief that never fully resolved, even once she learned her daughter was alive and thriving, because the daughter she found wasn't quite the one she'd spent 18 years imagining. Gloria, for her part, expressed remorse, but it wasn't enough to sway the sentence. She was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years in prison. A strange kind of symmetry, given that was almost exactly how long Kamaya had spent not knowing who she really was. Even after everything that came out in court, Kamia has refused to cut ties with the woman who raised her. In an interview conducted 20 years after the kidnapping, Shannara revealed a painful postscript to the story. She and Kamia were, at that point, no longer speaking. A story that should have ended in a perfect reunion instead left behind a far more complicated, far more human outcome. Two mothers, one truth, and a daughter caught permanently in between. Kamia's story is about a stolen identity built on a lie of love, a crime that somehow produced a genuinely happy childhood for the victim, which is exactly why the case still divides people who hear it. Our next case is something colder. No love, no adoptive family, just a woman who vanished after her employer allegedly threatened her life, leaving behind a trail of suspicion that took 17 years to untangle. Story 3. Denise Bolzer. On January 17, 1985, 24-year-old Denise Desrousseaux Bolzer vanished from her home in Raymond, New Hampshire. When her husband got home that day, it took him a full 6 hours to even notice something was wrong. A strange, unsettling note pinned to their refrigerator that simply read, "We've got your wife." When police arrived to investigate, all they found were footprints in the snow leading away from the house. No demand for ransom ever came. No one ever tried to make contact. The note offered no real clues about who had written it or why. Investigators eventually traced a lead to Logan Airport, where they found her husband's pickup truck abandoned in a parking lot. Sitting on the front seat, almost deliberately placed, were Denise's social security card, her birth certificate, and her credit cards. But there was no sign of Denise herself. The placement of those documents bothered investigators. It looked less like something a random abductor would bother doing, and much more like someone trying to send a message, or trying to make sure Denise could never be traced through any of her usual paper trail. With virtually nothing to go on, investigators hit a wall. Denise's family, who described themselves as extremely close with her, suspected something sinister had happened and pushed hard for the case to be treated as a potential abduction rather than a voluntary disappearance. Her husband, however, was never seriously considered a suspect, and he went on to file for divorce as the case dragged on without resolution, quietly moving on with his own life while Denise's family kept pushing for answers year after year. A few months after Denise disappeared, a new piece of the puzzle surfaced. The courier service where she had worked as a bookkeeper accused her of embezzling somewhere between $12,000 and a staggering $100,000. This opened up an entirely different theory. Maybe Denise hadn't been taken at all. Maybe she had run to escape the consequences of her own actions. It was a theory that reframed the entire case overnight. Instead of a sympathetic victim, some began to see Denise as a fugitive, and the ominous fridge note as an elaborate cover story staged to throw investigators off her trail. In 1986, formal embezzlement charges were filed against her. 7 years later, those charges were dropped entirely, and for a while, her family allowed themselves to hope she might finally come forward on her own. Now that the legal risk of doing so had technically disappeared, that hope sat dormant for nearly 2 decades. Then, in 2002, a private investigator named Shirley Casey handed authorities a promising lead. A woman living in Florida who matched Denise's physical description and shared her exact date of birth. Almost 17 years after she vanished, law enforcement was back on her trail. On May 13, 2002, Denise was finally located in Panama City, Florida, now living under the name Denise James. She had quietly rebuilt an entire life and started a new family, all without her old relatives, or anyone else, having the faintest idea she was still alive. When she was finally confronted, Denise revealed the real reason she'd disappeared. Her employer had allegedly threatened to kill her within 2 days if she didn't leave. In a desperate bid to disappear completely and cover her tracks, she'd moved through the Bahamas, California, South Carolina, and Hawaii, before finally settling into her new identity in Florida. It meant that the very same embezzlement accusations that once painted her as a criminal on the run were, according to Denise, actually connected to the reason she feared for her life in the first place. An inversion nobody investigating the case in 1985 had ever considered. With the mystery finally solved after 17 years, Denise was able to have an emotional, long overdue reunion with the family, who had spent almost 2 decades wondering whether she was alive, guilty, or gone forever. For her relatives, the years of uncertainty, not knowing if they should be grieving her or resenting her, finally gave way to something far simpler. Relief that she was alive, and answers for a mystery that had shadowed their family for the better part of 2 decades. Denise ran from a threat and stayed hidden for 17 years, and at least got the chance to explain herself in person once she was found. Our next case took over 5 decades to resolve, more than 3 times as long. And the truth, when it finally surfaced, completely rewrote what everyone thought they knew about why she left, and about the man who had lived under suspicion for the rest of his life because of it. Segment 4. Lucy Ann Johnson. Lucy Ann Johnson, born Lucy Ann Carriere on October 14, 1935, in Skagway, Alaska, spent her early years moving between small towns before her family eventually settled in the Yukon community of Carcross when she was 8 years old. A remote, close-knit community where everyone tended to know everyone else's business, which makes what happened later all the more strange. In 1953, she left Carcross, and from that point on, contact with her extended family became increasingly rare. The following year, Lucy met a man named Marvin Johnson. The two fell in love quickly and married soon after, relocating to Surrey, British Columbia. Lucy found work at a local hospital, while Marvin worked on a tugboat, a demanding, physically exhausting job that took a serious toll on him. Over time, he began drinking heavily to cope, and as his drinking worsened, so did his temper. Marvin became increasingly volatile, at times lashing out and even becoming physically abusive toward Lucy. From the outside, the Johnsons probably looked like any other young working-class family, raising 2 kids and getting by the best they could. Behind closed doors, though, Lucy was reportedly living with a level of fear that nobody outside that house fully understood. Their daughter, Linda, would later say she never witnessed outright violence from her father directly, but she strongly sensed that something abusive had been happening between her parents, the kind of tension a child picks up on without ever being told directly what's wrong. Then, in 1961, Lucy vanished without a trace. Strangely, Marvin didn't report her missing until 1965, a full 4 years after she disappeared. And even then, only after a concerned neighbor who hadn't seen Lucy in years tipped off the police. Think about that timeline for a moment. A mother of 2 young children simply gone, and her own husband apparently felt no urgency to tell a single authority for 4 straight years. That detail alone was enough to make investigators deeply suspicious of him from the very start. When officers questioned him, Marvin simply confirmed what the neighbor had already suspected. Lucy had been gone since 1961. Investigators initially suspected foul play, especially after a neighbor recalled seeing Marvin digging in his backyard around the time Lucy vanished. But a search of the property turned up nothing, leaving police without enough evidence to charge him with anything. DNA samples were collected from Lucy's children in case they were ever needed to identify unidentified remains, but no matches ever surfaced. As time went on, Marvin grew reluctant to even say Lucy's name. He eventually remarried and forbade his children, Linda and Daniel, from ever mentioning their mother again. Tragically, Lucy's son Daniel passed away in his late teens, never learning what became of his mother. Linda, despite losing her mother at just 7 years old, went on to build a full life of her own, marrying, raising a family, and eventually becoming a grandmother to 10 grandchildren, all while carrying an unanswered question about her mother that never fully went away, even decades later. Meanwhile, Lucy's disappearance became one of the longest-running unsolved cases in the history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, a file that got dustier every year, reopened periodically whenever new forensic techniques became available, and closed again just as quietly when nothing new turned up. By 2013, Linda, now in her 50s, had largely made peace with the idea that her mother was gone for good. But before letting go entirely, she decided to try one last, unlikely approach. Knowing her mother had originally come from Alaska, Linda placed a classified ad in the Yukon News, including Lucy's full name, date of birth, birthplace, and her parents' names. A final long-shot attempt at closure. What happened next stunned her. A woman named Rhonda, living in Whitehorse, Yukon, was told by her brother about a strange ad someone had placed, searching for a mother who shared the exact same name and personal details as their own mother. Curious and more than a little unsettled, Rhonda reached out to Linda. The moment they began talking, a connection was undeniable. They were related. Linda immediately made arrangements for a long overdue trip. When she stepped off the plane in Whitehorse, she was greeted by a crowd of family members she never knew existed. A half-sister, a half-brother, and 2 aunts, all waiting eagerly to meet her just outside the airport's fenced area, practically vibrating with anticipation after decades of not knowing this side of the family even existed. Among them, no one was more overjoyed than Lucy herself, who instantly recognized her daughter despite more than 50 years apart. Proof, if nothing else, that whatever time and distance had taken from them, it hadn't erased the bond entirely. Lucy Ann Johnson was alive and well. After vanishing in 1961, she had remained in British Columbia until the 1980s, before relocating to the Yukon, remarrying and raising 4 more children. When she finally explained what had happened all those years ago, her story flipped the entire case on its head. Her disappearance hadn't been some dark, sinister act carried out against her. It had been an escape. She revealed that she had tried to take her children with her when she left, but Marvin refused to let them go, leaving her with an impossible choice between staying in a home she feared for her safety in, or leaving without the 2 children she loved. Her account effectively cleared her late ex-husband of any suspected involvement in her disappearance, replacing decades of quiet suspicion with a far more painful truth. Lucy had simply been running for her life from an abusive marriage and had been forced to leave her own children behind to do it, a decision she reportedly carried guilt over for the rest of her life, even after starting over completely. Even after learning all of this, Linda said she felt no anger toward her mother. Instead, she simply hoped for the chance to build a relationship, and that her own children and grandchildren would eventually be welcomed into the family Lucy had spent the last 50 years building without her. Lucy's family got a joyful, if bittersweet, reunion after 52 years. Our final case tonight doesn't end quite so happily, because by the time the truth finally came out, 44 years had already passed, and it was far too late for a reunion at all. Segment 5, Tamara Milograd's. On September 18, 1971, 15-year-old Tamara Milograd's and 2 of her closest friends set off for the Royal Melbourne Show, an enormous annual carnival in Melbourne, Australia, that drew hundreds of thousands of visitors every year, the kind of event an entire city looked forward to, and the last place anyone would expect a teenager to vanish in broad daylight, surrounded by friends. When Tamara told her mother, Rubel, about the trip, Rubel, hearing how massive the crowds would be, offered to come along to keep an eye on the girls. Tamara firmly refused, insisting she and her friends could look out for each other. After a quick goodbye, she left with her friends for what was supposed to be an exciting day out. The group spent the day taking in everything the show had to offer: sheep shearing demonstrations, horse races, alpaca displays, and wood chopping competitions, all set against the noise and chaos of hundreds of thousands of fairgoers packed into the showground. Tamara had reportedly seemed unusually withdrawn and uneasy for most of the day, quieter than her friends were used to. At some point, she told them she needed to step away to find somewhere to exchange some money since she'd run out of cash. She promised to be back shortly. She never returned. As the minutes stretched into hours, panic set in. Her friends searched everywhere they could think of, with no luck, and were eventually forced to call Tamara's family. Her parents rushed to the showground immediately, and after hours of searching turned up nothing, they alerted the police. Despite an expanded search of the surrounding area, there was no trace of 15-year-old Tamara anywhere. As investigators dug into her home life, a more complicated picture emerged. Tamara had been going through a turbulent, rebellious phase, introverted, frequently skipping school, and locked in escalating tension with her family. She had run away once before, disappearing through her bedroom window for several days before eventually coming home on her own. Friends told police that shortly before she vanished for good, Tamara had a heated argument with her family over her boyfriend and had since been talking more and more about running away for good and starting a completely new life somewhere else. In the weeks that followed, scattered reports trickled in, witnesses who claimed to have seen Tamara hiding near the showground stables for a couple of days after she disappeared, rumors that she'd taken a job at a bar near the waterfront in St. Kilda, and a claimed sighting by a friend at a hotel elsewhere in the city. Each new tip sent investigators chasing another dead end, arriving just late enough or vague enough that nothing could ever be confirmed. None of it led anywhere concrete, but combined with her troubled home life, it was enough to convince investigators that Tamara had most likely left of her own free will. Her family refused to accept that as the end of the story. They hired a private investigator and personally traveled to every location where she was rumored to have been spotted. The stables, the bar in St. Kilda, the hotel where she was supposedly seen, only to come back empty-handed every single time, chasing a trail that always seemed to go cold just as it started to feel promising. Year after year, the case grew colder, but her parents never stopped hoping she would eventually come home, holding on to her old bedroom and her belongings long after most people would have given up. Tragically, after 18 years of waiting for answers that never came, Tamara's father passed away without ever learning what had happened to his daughter, carrying the uncertainty with him to his grave. In 2010, Melbourne launched a Missing Persons Week initiative, and Tamara's case was one of the stories featured to the public in hopes of generating new leads. 5 years later, in 2015, a woman named Karina Russell was browsing the Australian Federal Police's Missing Persons website when a photograph stopped her cold. A woman who looked remarkably like her own mother. Karina's mother had died in a car accident years earlier, when Karina was still a small child, leaving her with only fragments of memory and a lifetime of unanswered questions about who her mother really was. But growing up, Karina had slowly uncovered strange gaps in her mother's history, including the unsettling discovery that her parents had never actually been legally married, and that her mother had never been able to produce a birth certificate, something that always struck Karina as odd but never explainable. That nagging curiosity followed her well into adulthood. The similarities between the woman in the missing persons photo and the mother she remembered, right down to a shared birth date and an uncanny physical resemblance, were too strong to ignore. Karina contacted Australia's National Missing Persons Coordination Centre, unaware that what she was about to uncover would completely rewrite her understanding of who her mother really was. To confirm whether the woman in the photo, listed under the name Pauline Tammy Russell, was truly the long-missing Tamara Milograds, investigators reached out to Tamara's biological family and collected a DNA sample from one of her siblings. Experts at the Victorian Institute of Forensic Medicine confirmed the match. After 44 years of not knowing, Tamara's family finally had their answer. The truth was devastating in its own quiet way. After running away in 1971, Tamara had cut all ties with her old life, moved elsewhere in Victoria, changed her age to 18, and rebuilt herself entirely under the name Pauline Tammy Russell. She married, had 2 children, one of them Karina, and for a while lived the completely different life she'd once told her friends she was dreaming of. But that new life ended just as abruptly as her old one. Tamara died in a car crash years later, long before her biological family ever learned what had become of her. There was no joyful airport reunion waiting at the end of this one. Tamara's parents never got their answer while they were alive, and the sister and brother, who spent decades hoping for a phone call that would bring her home, instead got a DNA report confirming she had already been gone for years. But her surviving family finally got the one thing they'd been chasing for over 4 decades: the truth. And in the process, they gained something they never expected, a new branch of family they never knew existed, including Karina, who was welcomed into the fold with open arms, carrying a piece of the mother none of them had truly gotten to say goodbye to. In a strange way, Tamara's own daughter became the closest thing her birth family would ever get to seeing her again. Outrow 5 children, 5 families torn apart in completely different ways, A son who found out his loving father was also his kidnapper. A newborn stolen from a hospital bassinet, raised for 18 years under a stranger's name. A woman who vanished under threat and quietly rebuilt her life under a new identity. A mother who 50 years later turned out to be running from abuse, not towards some dark secret. And a teenage girl whose new life, and whose truth, only reached her original family decades after she was already gone. What ties every one of these cases together isn't just the disappearance, it's the aftermath. The children who grew up not knowing who they really were. The parents who spent decades not knowing if hope was even worth holding on to. And the uncomfortable reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't bring the closure we expect it to. Sometimes it brings more grief. Sometimes it brings a whole new family you never knew you had. And sometimes, like with Tamara, it simply confirms what everyone feared, decades after it could have changed anything. If these stories hit you as hard as they hit us, make sure you're subscribed because there are more cases just like these coming soon. And if you had to pick just one, we're genuinely curious. Was it Julian's conflicted loyalty to his father, Kamaya's impossible choice between two mothers, or Tamara's family finally getting an answer decades too late? Let us know in the comments which one of these 5 stories affected you the most. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. A woman trapped upside down in a car at the bottom of a ravine for 8 straight days, while a 911 operator tells her husband she's simply a grown woman free to go wherever she wants. A soldier who spent nearly 30 years alone in a jungle, still fighting a war that ended before most of his hiding place's neighbors were even born. A baby who vanished from Hawaii and grew up, completely unaware, to eventually solve his own disappearance decades later, purely by pure, unlikely accident. Unlike the videos before this one, tonight's stories aren't about people who deliberately chose to vanish. They're about survival against odds that should have been impossible and returns that nobody was prepared for. Some of these endings will make you genuinely furious. One of them will honestly inspire you more than almost anything else we've covered. And at least one of them will leave you seriously wondering whether coming back is always the miracle it sounds like on the surface. 5 stories, 5 completely different kinds of impossible situations. Let's get into it now, starting with the one story that will genuinely make you want to throw something at your screen. Story 1, Tanya Ryder. Tanya Ryder and her husband Tom were, in every ordinary sense, a young couple doing what a lot of young couples do, juggling multiple jobs at once, saving every spare dollar toward the dream of owning their own home, the kind of quiet, unremarkable grind that never makes headlines until something goes horribly wrong. On September the 20th, 2007, Tanya finished a shift at a supermarket in Maple Valley, Washington, and, completely worn out from back-to-back jobs and barely any sleep, got in her car to head home for a few hours of rest before her second job of the day. She was only minutes from home. That exhaustion caught up with her. Her grip on the wheel loosened, and her car drifted off the road, plunging into a ravine roughly 20 feet deep. When she regained consciousness, she was hanging upside down inside her own car, held in place by her seatbelt and wedged tightly against the steering wheel. Several of her ribs were already broken, and her left leg had gone completely numb. When Tanya didn't come home, Tom called the police, frantic. What happened next is the part of this story that still makes people furious to this day, nearly 2 decades later. The operator who took his call essentially refused to file a missing persons report, explaining that Tanya's situation didn't meet the necessary criteria. She wasn't a minor, and she wasn't considered at risk. The operator reportedly told Tom that his wife was a grown woman, free to go wherever she pleased without having to inform anybody. Somewhere in that same conversation, while Tom was being told to essentially calm down and wait, his wife was hanging upside down in a wrecked car less than a mile from the road, slowly running out of time. Tom knew his wife, and knew this wasn't like her at all. She didn't just vanish without a word, not after a night shift, not with a second job waiting. Refusing to accept that answer, he called the station again and again, repeating the entire story, from scratch, to every new operator who picked up, until one of them finally, mercifully, agreed to file the report. While all of this was happening, Tanya was living through an absolute nightmare. Trapped in total darkness for what would stretch into days, her only source of comfort was the faint glow of her phone screen, still displaying Tom's name every time she desperately tried to reach it, only for the pain and the way she was pinned in place to force her to give up each time. She screamed her husband's name until the phone battery finally died completely. As the days wore on, Tanya drifted in and out of consciousness, growing weaker with every passing hour. At her most delirious, she began hallucinating that she was dialing 911, only to imagine the operator laughing in her face before the line went dead, a nightmare that, tragically, wasn't all that far removed from the real dismissiveness her husband had actually experienced trying to get help for her. Even after Tom finally convinced authorities that his wife was genuinely in danger, the investigation's first move wasn't to search for Tanya. It was, painfully, to investigate Tom himself, a standard but agonizing procedure for any spouse of a missing person. Frustrated but desperate to move things along, he willingly agreed to a full search of their home and a polygraph test, understanding that the faster he was ruled out as a suspect, the faster an actual search for his wife could realistically begin. Once cleared, investigators reviewed supermarket surveillance footage showing Tanya driving away from the parking lot, her last confirmed sighting anywhere. Her bank accounts showed absolutely no activity at all, ruling out the possibility that she'd simply walked away from her own life. Finally, investigators traced her cell phone signal to a tower along Highway 169 in Renton, a suburb of Seattle. Once they finally searched the correct stretch of road, it took a mere 20 minutes to find her. 20 minutes, after 8 days of searching everywhere else. By the time rescuers reached her, Tanya had been trapped in that ravine for 8 full days without food or water, in a vehicle that was likely invisible from the road above unless you knew exactly where to look. Her body was frail, starved, and severely dehydrated. She had, by her own account, essentially given up hope and made peace with dying, drifting toward what she remembered as a warm, radiant meadow in her mind, the kind of peaceful hallucination the body sometimes offers when it's running out of options. "She's alive!" one of the state troopers shouted after spotting her car wedged among the trees below. Rescuers sliced through the vehicle's roof to pull her out and airlifted her straight to the hospital. Her injuries were severe: multiple broken ribs, a shattered collarbone, a dislocated shoulder, kidney damage caused by toxins released from days of crushed, immobile muscle tissue, and a badly mangled leg that came dangerously, agonizingly close to requiring full amputation. When Tanya woke up in the hospital, her husband Tom was right there beside her, the same man who had refused to give up on her from the very first phone call, who'd offered a reward, pushed authorities relentlessly, and voluntarily submitted to a polygraph just to speed up the search. A few years later, Tanya published a memoir titled Missing Without a Trace, 8 Days of Horror, sharing her story publicly in the sincere hope that no other family would ever again be told by a police dispatcher that a missing loved one simply had the right to disappear without anyone bothering to look. Tanya survived 8 days trapped in a ravine because her husband refused to take no for an answer, and because rescuers happened to search the right stretch of highway before it was too late. Our next case is almost the opposite kind of survival story, not 8 days, but nearly 3 full decades, and not a husband fighting for answers, but a man completely alone, still fighting a war that had ended before he ever knew it was over. Story 2. Teruo Nakamura. Teruo Nakamura was born on October 18, 1919, a member of the Amis, an indigenous tribe from the island of Formosa, what we now call Taiwan, which at the time was a colony under Japanese rule. He was 20 years old when the Second World War broke out, and his early life had already been defined by relentless poverty. Driven by a sense of duty, and likely by economic necessity as well, he enlisted in the Takasago Volunteer Unit of the Japanese Imperial Army in November of 1943, and was stationed on Morotai Island in what was then the Dutch East Indies. On September 15, 1944, American and Australian forces launched a major assault on the island, a conflict that would come to be known as the Battle of Morotai. Japanese forces fought fiercely but were overwhelmed, suffering devastating losses. While most of the surviving soldiers eventually surrendered, were captured, or succumbed to hunger and illness, a small number retreated deep into the island's dense jungle interior, determined to make a final stand. Nakamura was among them, part of a unit tasked with carrying out guerrilla warfare if the situation called for it. About 2 months after the assault began, having lost all radio contact with his unit, the Japanese army formally declared Nakamura and his remaining comrades dead. He wasn't dead. He was very much alive, just completely cut off from the outside world, and it would take 3 full decades before his family ever learned the truth. For the first 12 years, Nakamura survived alongside a small group of fellow stragglers, living off bananas and fish caught from the surrounding waters, treating every rustle in the jungle as a possible enemy patrol. None of them had any idea the war had actually ended in September of 1945. Leaflets announcing Japan's surrender were even dropped over the island that same year, but Nakamura and his comrades dismissed them as nothing more than enemy propaganda, a trick meant to lure them out of hiding, a belief reinforced by the aircraft they kept spotting overhead, which they assumed were part of an ongoing arms race between the Allied and Axis powers. In reality, those planes belonged to a nearby Indonesian Air Force base, simply conducting routine practice flights, completely unrelated to any war that was, by that point, already ancient history to everyone except the handful of men still hiding in that jungle. In 1956, following what was reportedly an attempt on his life, Nakamura parted ways with his remaining comrades and struck out completely on his own, building a modest hut in an open field. He survived by cultivating sweet potatoes and foraging bananas, fished regularly to supplement his diet, and even built himself a makeshift abacus just to occupy his mind through the isolation. To avoid detection, he only ever cooked under the cover of darkness, hiding any telltale smoke from prying eyes. He tracked the passage of time by observing the phases of the moon, tying a new knot into a length of rope to mark each passing month and year. Living with almost no human contact whatsoever, what kept him going, by his own later account, was nothing more than the hope that he would one day be reunited with the family he'd left behind. Eventually, Nakamura managed to befriend a kind, elderly local man, who would occasionally bring him basic provisions and small luxuries like tea and coffee, tiny gestures of humanity in a life that had otherwise become almost entirely solitary. This quiet arrangement continued for several years until the old man eventually passed away, but not before asking his own son, on his deathbed, to continue looking after Nakamura, a final act of kindness passed down like an inheritance. Accounts differ on exactly what happened next. Some say the old man's son was the one who eventually alerted authorities to Nakamura's presence on the island, while others claim it was a pilot who happened to spot his hut from the air. Either way, in November of 1974, the Indonesian government received a tip about a former Japanese soldier possibly still hiding out on Morotai Island, and coordinated with the Japanese embassy to launch a formal search mission. To try to draw him out, searchers waved a Japanese flag and played the country's national anthem near the area. Their efforts paid off. On December the 18th, 1974, Teruo Nakamura, now 55 years old, finally emerged from the jungle, naked, unkempt, and utterly exhausted, yet in remarkably sound physical condition after everything he'd endured, a fact doctors found almost as astonishing as the story itself. He was transported to a hospital in Jakarta, given a clean bill of health, and Indonesian authorities arranged for his return to Taiwan, where his family was waiting, having long since accepted that he was simply another name lost to a war that had claimed millions. What he found waiting for him there was a life almost entirely unrecognizable from the one he'd left behind nearly 3 decades earlier. His parents, once the pillars of his entire world, had both died years earlier, without ever learning their son had survived. His son, who had been a mere infant when Nakamura first enlisted, had grown into a full adult man with 4 children of his own, making Nakamura a grandfather to grandchildren he'd never even known existed. His wife, long since convinced he had died in the war, had remarried and moved on with her life, as anyone reasonably would after 30 years of silence. Then came the matter of his military pension. Despite serving nearly 30 years, technically still on active duty the entire time, the Japanese government refused to pay him his full back pay, arguing that because Taiwan was no longer under Japanese rule, he wasn't technically considered a Japanese citizen. The decision sparked genuine public outrage, especially since another famous Japanese holdout, Hiro Onoda, had been discovered in the Philippines just months earlier and received his full military entitlements without issue. The key difference being that Onoda was an actual Japanese national holding the rank of officer, while Nakamura was only ever a private and ethnically Taiwanese rather than Japanese. In the end, after nearly 30 years of unbroken military service in brutal conditions, Nakamura received a final payout equivalent to roughly 227 American dollars. Following intense, sustained public backlash over how unfairly he'd clearly been treated, the Taiwanese government eventually stepped in and made him a separate donation worth roughly the same amount Onoda had received. Back home, Nakamura often seemed weary despite his outward physical health, though he maintained that the hope of reuniting with his family was the one thing that had kept him alive through it all. In a remarkable gesture, his wife's new husband offered to step aside completely and let the old couple reconcile, even offering to move out of the house entirely. Not wanting to upend the life she'd built without him, Nakamura instead chose to buy a home nearby, visiting frequently. He spent his final 4 years living a quiet, peaceful life surrounded by family, before passing away on June the 15th, 1979, after a long illness, leaving behind a legacy remembered as both a courageous soldier and a devoted family man. Nakamura's family waited 30 years without knowing whether he was alive or dead, clinging to a hope that eventually paid off in the most unlikely way imaginable. Our next case flips that same kind of mystery completely on its head. Instead of a family waiting for a man to come home, this is a man who grew up perfectly happy, with absolutely no idea that his entire identity, right down to his own name, was never actually real to begin with. Story 3. Mark's Panama Barns. In July of 1977, a 6-month-old baby boy was reported missing in Honolulu, Hawaii. His birth mother, Charlotte, had been struggling with severe, untreated mental illness, and had been wandering aimlessly for some time before being caught trespassing on private property. When questioned by police, she gave a false name for herself, claiming to be someone named Jane, and lied about her infant son's name and date of birth as well, telling officers his father was a native Hawaiian and inventing an entirely different identity for the child on the spot. Charlotte was admitted to a psychiatric ward, and her baby was placed in an orphanage less than 30 miles from where they'd lived. When Charlotte was eventually released, she never came back for her son. She simply vanished, never to be seen or heard from again, leaving behind a case with no leads, no suspects, and, for a long time, no real hope of resolution. The baby, whose real name was Mark's Panama Barns, was adopted and grew up with absolutely no knowledge of any of this whatsoever, living an entirely ordinary, happy, and by all appearances completely unremarkable life under a completely different name, with no reason to ever suspect his childhood had actually begun with a psychiatric ward and an orphanage bed. His case might never have been solved at all, if not for the persistence of one determined relative. His half-sister, Jennifer, who was 8 years older than him, and had been living in New Mexico with her own father at the time both her mother and her baby brother vanished within the same year. When Jennifer eventually learned the full details of what had actually happened, she was utterly devastated and quietly determined to find out the truth no matter how long it took. In 2001, she flew to Hawaii and personally pleaded with the police department to reopen her brother's long-dormant case. At her request, police commissioned a forensic sketch artist to create an age-progressed illustration of what her missing brother might look like as a grown man. 10 years later, that exact sketch would end up in the hands of the very man it was created to find. By complete coincidence, the adult man, now going by the name Stephen, came across the illustration and was stunned by how much it resembled his own face, almost as if he were staring directly into a mirror. Friends and family who saw it agreed the resemblance was uncanny, too precise to write off as pure chance. Stephen, understandably, refused to believe it at first, clinging to the comfortable version of his life he'd always known. It was his wife who ultimately pushed him to follow through and get real answers, even though part of him genuinely wondered whether he even had the courage to knock on that particular door, knowing there might be no going back to blissful ignorance once he did. He contacted the Honolulu Police Department, whose officers weren't entirely sure what to expect. After all, Marks's case had been open for roughly 3 decades at that point, and the odds of solving a case that cold, from a random phone call, were slim to none. Still, they took the report seriously. Only a DNA test could settle it for certain, and 8 long months passed while Stephen waited for an answer that would either confirm his growing suspicion or put the whole unsettling coincidence to rest. When the results finally came back, Stephen's entire understanding of his own identity was shattered in an instant. His suspicions were confirmed. His real name was Marks Panama Barnes, and he had just solved one of the longest-running missing persons cases in American history, as the missing person himself, using nothing more than a stranger's sketch and a decade of quiet curiosity. After the media frenzy that inevitably followed a story this remarkable eventually settled down, Stephen was finally ready to reconnect with his biological family. He reached out first to his half-sister Jennifer, who was overwhelmed with emotion and profound relief at finally having answers about her brother's fate after all those years. He then contacted his biological father, Mark, who was absolutely thrilled to finally meet the son he'd lost decades earlier. As for his birth mother, Charlotte, her fate remains a total mystery to this day. She was never seen or heard from again after the day her infant son was taken from her. Mark spent 34 years living happily under an identity that wasn't even his own, blissfully unaware that somewhere out there, a sister was fighting to keep his case alive. Our next case is far messier, with far fewer clean answers. A woman whose disappearance triggered a genuine years-long manhunt, complete with a chilling hoax letter, a convicted killer with unsettling ties to the case, and a truth that, once it finally surfaced, turned out to be far more complicated and far more human than anyone had expected. Story 4. Michelle Whitaker. Michelle Whitaker was born on August the 16th, 1969, into a large family of 7. By all accounts, she was a happy, energetic child who cherished every moment with her loved ones, the kind of kid who lit up a room without even trying. That began to change around age 15, when her family relocated to Gastonia, North Carolina, and Michelle's teenage years turned turbulent, marked by growing conflict with her mother over what Michelle saw as overly strict rules and a desperate craving for approval that never quite felt satisfied. She briefly considered joining the Navy, but instead fell for a Navy recruiter several years her senior, marrying him against her mother's wishes shortly after high school graduation. The marriage didn't last, ending in unhappiness not long after it began, another disappointment in a life that seemed to be collecting them. Seeking a true fresh start, the family eventually relocated again, this time to Spartanburg, South Carolina. As Michelle approached her 30th birthday, life remained a genuine struggle, working a part-time waitressing job and barely scraping by, month after month, with little sign of things getting easier. Then, one evening after a long shift, she crossed paths with a man named David. Charming and charismatic at first, exactly the kind of easy confidence that makes someone feel safe getting into a car with, David's true nature surfaced after he offered her a ride home, brutally assaulting her and leaving her face badly battered and bruised. A year later, David was finally arrested and charged with assault and battery, eventually receiving an 8-year prison sentence, a small measure of justice that came far too late to undo the damage already done. But the trauma of the attack sent Michelle's life into a downward spiral, drifting between her parents' home and friends' houses, sometimes sleeping in her car, caught in a punishing cycle of anxiety and depression that eventually landed her briefly behind bars, following a drunk driving incident, one more low point in a stretch of years that seemed determined to keep knocking her down. After serving her time, Michelle vowed, sincerely, to finally turn her life around and leave the chaos of the previous few years behind her for good. But on August the 5th, 2002, a heated argument with her mother, Laura, ended with Michelle storming out of the house. When Laura calmed down, she realized she had no idea where her daughter had actually gone. Her anxiety only deepened when a man Michelle had been staying with told her he hadn't seen Michelle in days either. Because Michelle was a legal adult with an established pattern of drifting, police initially had limited options. Even a family friend on the force reassured Laura her daughter would likely turn up on her own soon. She didn't. An official missing persons report was finally filed on August the 21st, 2002, roughly 2 full weeks after anyone had last seen her. Investigators dug into every angle, bank records showing no activity, interviews with her ex-husband, family, and co-workers, none of which turned up any solid leads at all. Eventually, they identified a man named Doug Gilmore as the last person known to have seen Michelle, having spent the evening with her at a local pool hall, talking and laughing over drinks, before the two of them took off together on a motorcycle ride into the night. Doug fully cooperated, willingly passed a polygraph test, and explained that he'd dropped Michelle off the next morning at a nearby truck stop, at her own request, since she'd expressed a desire to head toward Myrtle Beach. From there, the trail went completely cold. As the case grew colder, Michelle's mother pleaded with local television stations to keep her daughter's story alive in the headlines, refusing to let the world forget her daughter's name, even as the leads dried up one by one. Then, in August of 2005, nearly 3 years after Michelle vanished, an anonymous and deeply disturbing letter arrived at the police station, claiming to know the exact location of Michelle's body, describing a spot near tall pine trees at the edge of a pond, roughly 25 miles from the truck stop where she was last seen. For a family that had spent 3 years bracing for the worst possible news, that letter felt like the moment everything finally came to a close, one way or another. Police searched the area exhaustively for 2 full days and found absolutely nothing. The letter turned out to be nothing more than a cruel, elaborate hoax, written by someone who apparently got some twisted satisfaction from watching a grieving family's hope rise and then collapse all over again. Utterly devastating for a family already worn down by years of uncertainty. Just months later, in October of 2005, a man named Jonathan Vick was arrested for the brutal murder of Dana Satterfield, the owner of a local beauty salon located roughly 12 miles from where Michelle was last seen. For a moment, it looked like the case might finally be cracking open. Police immediately suspected a possible connection. Jonathan had been a regular at the diner where Michelle once worked, and disturbingly, he was also already a prime suspect in the unresolved disappearance of his own former fiancée, a woman named Heather Sellers, who had also worked as a waitress, just like Michelle. 2 missing waitresses, 1 dead salon owner, and 1 man connected to all 3 cases. It was the kind of pattern that makes investigators sit up straight. Despite the eerie parallels, though, investigators were never able to find any concrete evidence tying Jonathan to either Michelle's or Heather's disappearances, no matter how hard they looked. He was convicted of Dana Satterfield's murder in November of 2006 and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 60 years, but was never formally charged in connection with either missing woman, leaving Michelle's family with a chilling coincidence instead of the answer they'd been hoping for. 5 long years after Michelle's disappearance, her family gathered for a solemn vigil in her memory, and Laura built a heartfelt memorial webpage filled with photos spanning her daughter's life. Then, in August of 2008, everything changed with a single phone call, arriving completely out of nowhere after 6 years of silence. A woman contacted a police lieutenant, claiming Michelle Whitaker was alive and living in Oregon. She'd recognized Michelle from an episode of the television show Forensic Files, combined with photos she'd seen on the memorial webpage Laura had painstakingly built over the years. To prove her claim, the caller snapped a photo of Michelle and sent it in, and law enforcement passed it along for verification. Oregon State Police paid a visit to the address, where Michelle confirmed her own identity without hesitation, and a fingerprint test later verified beyond doubt that she truly was the long-missing woman everyone had been searching for. When told her family had spent 6 agonizing years searching for her, driving themselves half-mad with worry, Michelle explained that she'd simply grown exhausted with the chaotic life she'd been living, and had convinced herself, after the fight with her mother, that disappearing entirely would somehow lift a burden off her family, rather than add an even heavier one. Her original plan had been to reach Myrtle Beach for informal, under-the-table work, but her journey ended up taking her much further than she ever intended. through Las Vegas, through California, and finally settling down in Oregon, all while she claims she used her own real name the entire time, seemingly, almost unbelievably, unaware of the massive, years-long search happening for her back home the entire time. Michelle expressed deep remorse over the toll her disappearance took on her family and the enormous resources spent by police searching for her. Since being found, she has worked to rebuild and strengthen her relationship with her mother, Laura. Michelle Whitaker's disappearance was, in the end, driven by exhaustion and guilt, a young woman trying to lighten a burden she felt she'd become to the people who loved her. Our final case tonight is a lot less sympathetic and a lot less about survival in the way we usually mean it on this channel. A woman whose miracle return turned out to have very little to do with luck or fate, and a lot more to do with simply running out of new identities to hide behind. Story 5. Michelle McMullen. 27-year-old Michelle McMullen was a resident of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, who had relocated to Louisiana to finish her degree at Grambling State University, chasing the kind of fresh start a college degree is supposed to represent. Balancing full-time school with raising her 6-year-old son, Jalen, entirely on her own proved to be a serious, exhausting financial struggle, and Michelle eventually decided to send Jalen back home to Harrisburg to live with her parents, while she stayed behind in Louisiana to complete her studies, telling herself it was a temporary sacrifice for a better future down the road. On September the 28th, 2008, Michelle arrived back in Pennsylvania, but instead of heading straight to her parents' house, she dropped Jalen off at a friend's place instead. An odd first move that nobody thought much of at the time. Her parents didn't even learn she was in town until the following day. That same day, after saying goodnight to her son and telling her friend she'd call again in a couple of hours, Michelle set off on the drive back to Louisiana. She never made that call. It was the last anyone heard from her for a very long time. Her car was later discovered abandoned in Hagerstown, Maryland, with her wallet, cell phone, and other personal belongings still sitting inside. The classic hallmarks of a case that looked, at first glance, exactly like an abduction or worse. On October the 9th, 2008, local police announced a twist nobody was expecting. Michelle was actually wanted on theft charges. It turned out she'd been working as a secretary for a local Presbyterian church and had stolen nearly $2,400 before being fired that July for poor performance, a detail that suddenly cast her disappearance in a very different light. Then, in December of that same year, detectives received an intriguing tip. A woman matching Michelle's description had been spotted working at a hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia, where she'd convinced the owner to hire her by claiming she was fleeing an abusive relationship and desperately needed the income, a story that, ironically, wasn't entirely different in tone from the truth she was actually running from. The lead came from an old associate of Michelle's who happened to visit the hotel and instantly recognized her. When confronted, the woman denied knowing him entirely, insisting her name was actually Monique Watson, delivering the lie with enough confidence that a stranger might have believed her. Her old friend wasn't buying it for a second, though. Michelle's parents were immediately notified, hearts racing with the possibility that their daughter was finally, actually alive, but by the time police arrived at the hotel, she had already vanished again, one step ahead as always. The case remained unsolved until February of 2010, when an American true crime documentary series aired Michelle's story during a rerun. One sharp-eyed viewer, watching from her own living room, instantly recognized the woman in the segment as her own hairdresser, someone she'd been sitting across from, trusting with scissors near her scalp, for who knows how long without the faintest idea who she really was. It turned out that Michelle had made her way all the way to California, where she'd met the owner of a beauty salon and lied to her, claiming to be a survivor of Hurricane Katrina who'd lost everything in the storm. Moved by sympathy for a woman who'd supposedly lost her home, her belongings, and her sense of normalcy overnight, the salon owner had taken Michelle in almost like a daughter, even personally teaching her how to style hair, giving her both a trade and, unknowingly, the perfect cover story. After finally being caught, Michelle claimed the roughly $2,400 she'd taken from the church were simply extra paychecks she'd used to fund her education, a justification investigators weren't particularly inclined to believe, and was ultimately charged with theft, forgery, and fraud. In her own words, she later confessed to investigators that the constant gnawing fear of eventually getting caught had tormented her far more than any prison sentence realistically ever could. Years of looking over her shoulder, inventing new names, and rehearsing new backstories every time someone got a little too curious. In the end, Michelle McMullen was sentenced to probation, along with a fine of $6,000, a strikingly quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for a story that had, at one point, looked disturbingly like it might end the same way as several of the darker cases we've covered on this channel. 5 very different kinds of survival, and 5 very different kinds of return. A woman who nearly died in a ravine because a stranger on a phone line decided her disappearance simply wasn't urgent enough, saved in the end only because her husband refused to accept no as a final answer. A soldier who spent 30 years defending an island in a war that had already ended decades earlier, sustained by nothing but hope, a homemade rope calendar, and the quiet kindness of one old stranger who brought him tea. A man who spent his entire childhood and early adulthood as someone else entirely, with no idea his name, his birthday, and his very first months of life had all been erased by his own mother's illness, and who ended up solving his own 34-year-old missing persons case using nothing but a police sketch and a healthy dose of stubbornness. A woman whose exhaustion, guilt, and desperate need to escape a chaotic life sent her running for 6 long years, only to be recognized, of all things, because of a rerun of a true crime television show, and a woman whose return turned out to have far less to do with being found by loving searchers, and a lot more to do with finally running out of places left to hide from the consequences of her own choices. If there's one thing tonight's stories prove, it's that not every disappearance is the same kind of tragedy. Not every survival story ends the way you expect, and not every miracle ending feels quite like a miracle once you know the whole truth behind it. Some of these people were victims of pure circumstance. Some were victims of a system that failed them at exactly the wrong moment. And at least one of them, in the end, was really only ever running from herself. If these cases had you shouting at your screen, hit that subscribe button, because we've got plenty more where these came from. Real disappearances, real families, and endings that are almost always stranger than anything scripted. Let us know in the comments which case made you the most furious, which one genuinely restored a little bit of your faith in people, and which one you're still thinking about an hour from now. Thanks so much for watching this one all the way through, and we'll see you in the very next one.